Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. And here we are together on Climate Day to do our little panel, which is really about bringing the connection of the plastic crisis and the climate crisis that we know are so intrinsically connected. My name is Sian Sutherland, and I'm co-founder of A Plastic Planet and also the Plastic Health Council. And the first thing I'd love to do is really just rotate around the screen and for each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about yourself. And let's start with Zara.
Hello, thank you, Sean. I'm Zara. I'm 15 years old, and I co-founded Hidden Plastic with my brother in 2020 when I was 11. And we create videos to educate about the dangers of the plastics you might not see or know about, or the hidden plastics. And I'm also a seaweed ambassador and have started Super Seaweed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zara. We look forward to digging a little deeper on that. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Pete Myers.
Hi, I'm Pete Myers. I am Chief Scientist of Environmental Health Sciences, and I've been working on the bad effects of chemicals in plastic for 30 years. And I've learned a lot, and I want to share some of that with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pete. And then finally, the esteemed Carroll Muffett.
I am Carroll Muffett. I'm the president of the Center for International Environmental Law. I've been working to address the climate crisis with my colleagues at CL for just slightly less time than Pete's been working on it. And we have been working to confront the intersection between climate, plastics, and toxics for many years as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Carol. Thank you, everybody. So really just to set the scene, and let's set the scene on what man's impact has been on our beautiful planet Earth, because of course it's Climate Day. And it struck me that when you look at the fact that we have in the last 100 years lost 90% of our large fish in the ocean. In the last 20 years, we've lost in Europe alone up to 80% of our winged insects. The impact that man has had on our planet is really extraordinary. If you piled all the mammals up in one space, only 4% of those would actually be wild animals now. So that's the impact that we have had on the planet. And of course, the collective people on this Zoom call are obsessed by this gateway to our impact on the planet. And that gateway is through our misuse of this incredible but toxic and indestructible material of plastic that has become the default for everything. So I'd love to start with you, Carol, and really see if you could explain a little bit to us about the connection between the climate crisis and the plastic crisis. And then also perhaps tell us a little about the fact that we know that there is now this UN Global Plastics Treaty that's currently being negotiated. Does that give you any hope? Enlighten us.
Absolutely. The connections between the plastic crisis and the climate crisis are fundamental. And they begin with the fact that plastics are simply fossil fuels in another form. 99% of what goes into plastics is oil, gas, and even coal. And that means that the fossil fuels that are responsible for more than 80% of all global climate emissions are also at the very heart of the plastics problem. And this is set to get much, much worse as oil and gas companies look to plastics as an escape hatch as the world works to get oil and gas out of energy and transportation. What we're seeing is these industries are saying as fuel goes down, plastics need to go up. And that is bad for the climate, both because plastic production releases massive amounts of climate emissions, but also because plastics in the environment have very direct climate impacts, both from off-gassing methane and other climate gases, and by potentially interfering with things like the ocean's biological carbon pump. And so these impacts are pervasive. The most recent analysis by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs says on our present trajectory, the expansion of plastics production and use could use up to 30% of the Earth's remaining carbon budget in a 1.5 degree world. 30%. That is staggering. And this is why the Global Plastic Treaty is so critically important, not only to addressing the plastic crisis, but to addressing the climate dimensions of plastics and fossil fuels. With it, we have a rare opportunity to send a signal to the entire world that we need to get off not just fossil fuels, but the fossil economy. And plastics are the very best place to start.
And how do you feel it's going at the moment, Carroll, with the plastics treaty? Are you hopeful that this is going to have the impact that we need?
If you look at where we began and where we are, we have come an incredible distance. The idea that the world, even a few years ago, would be negotiating a global treaty to address the plastics crisis was almost unthinkable. And the idea that that treaty could include plastic production, could address the health impacts of plastics on communities where plastics are made, on communities where they're disposed, and on the communities around the world that live with plastics every day, that was a staggering impossibility, and we've made it possible. And I think the really encouraging thing about the plastic treaty is that leadership for it is coming from countries around the world. It's not a single country, a single region that is saying we need this. It's many countries, many regions saying we need great ambition. Along with that, we face extraordinary challenges. The industries and the countries that rely on oil and gas revenues and profits, and that are banking on a petrochemical future, they are fighting hook and claw to keep us from making real progress on this plastic treaty. And so we have a long way to go. But when you look at where we started and you look at where we need to be, yes, I am optimistic. We just can't slow down the fight.
Great. Thank you so much, Carroll, for that note of optimism at the end. Pete, I wonder if you share that same optimism when we look at the impact of plastics on human health. And I know from my times at the INC process, the negotiations of the UN Plastics Treaty, that I think people have been surprised, actually, at the amount of attention that the impact on human health of the chemicals and the micro and nanoplastics has really been given through this process. Can you tell us a little? I know you have at least 30 years experience, and you are the man who coined the phrase endocrine disrupting chemicals that we are absorbing into our bodies through plastic. Can you give us a little bit more information on the impact on human health, where it's coming from, the scale of it, where you see that going?
I can. But I'd like to begin by piling on to Carroll's optimism.
Great.
By pointing out an article that appeared in the Washington Post this week, and it had an interesting confession by the American Chemistry Council. Now, the American Chemistry Council is one of the chief manufacturers of doubt. They don't want anything to interfere with plastic production. At the meeting for the UN treaty in Ottawa just 2 months ago, they were leaders among those saying, don't bother, this isn't necessary. We can keep on producing as much as we want. Well, in this article, they switched that communications strategy from, don't worry, we've got it, to we are now investing $15 million into health research on plastic. That may not sound like a lot. In fact, it's not a lot of money compared to how much money they make producing plastics. But it's a complete change in the frame they are representing to the public at large. They're saying, yes, this is important. Health is important, and we've got to get ahead of it. Now, I don't have great hopes that the science they do will be good for the treaty process, because they are infamous for creating science that serves their purpose. It's called manufacturing doubt. But the mere fact that they have acknowledged publicly that health research is necessary for dealing with this problem is a major change. And we have done that in this process. Like Carroll pointed out, imagining a UN treaty process that would wind up with laws, enforceable laws and requirements 3 or 4 years ago was simply unthinkable. And now we are learning that even the industry says we got to deal with health issues. Now, specifically with respect to some of the reasons why considering health is so important, let me just step back for a sec and mention a great friend of ours, Nate Hawkins, who is the producer of this wonderful award-winning podcast called
Great Simplification.
The Great Simplification. And Nate is fabulous with this. Nate emphasizes in his work that you can't deal with one problem at a time. You've got to deal with a systems approach. If you don't look at it from a systems perspective, the solutions to one problem will probably undermine the solutions to another problem. And that's why we have to address the plastics issue as part of the climate issue, part and parcel, because the climate issue is part of the plastics issue, as Carroll said so effectively. So I study the chemicals in plastics, and also we're beginning to work on how microplastics and nanoplastics affect health in humans. We know a lot. We know decades worth of scientific research on how chemicals in plastics are harmful to human health. They contribute to a range of diseases like diabetes, type 2 diabetes. How many of your family have type 2 diabetes? How many have suffer from infertility? Infertility is another major result of exposure to plastic chemicals. Heart disease, and in fact, even death, are results from inappropriate exposures to plastics. Now, you got to understand plastics on one hand some plastics do miracles for healthcare. That's just a fact of how hospitals are put together. But not all the plastics in a hospital are necessary. And what we have to do in our efforts to deal with this problem is first figure out what are essential uses of plastic, set them aside for the moment. We'll begin to attack them as time permits with innovation and new types of materials that we'll be able to use instead of plastics. But let's first identify what types of plastic uses are not essential and get rid of them. And we can reduce production of plastic a lot through that first step.
So Pete, as we were speaking at the beginning of this session, and I was talking about our impact on everything else that lives on our planet, obviously we're very concerned about the impact on human health because we are the most selfish species imaginable. But do you imagine that probably we're having a similar impact on everything else that lives on our planet through this addiction to plastic?
In my estimation as a scientist, there's no way we are not having impacts on the rest of the biodiversity on the planet directly because of how chemicals interfere with basic signaling molecules that are in our bodies and the bodies of other mammals, the bodies of reptiles, the bodies of birds, even the bodies of insects. We know that those chemicals are harmful to a wide array of animals. And there's no way that the current levels of contamination are not having their effects. But here's the rub. While it's taken us tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to do the research that confirms what the effects are on people, we haven't had that much money to spend on what the effects are on animals. And so I actually, this is kind of ironic, but if you've heard about the canary in the coal mine that was used by coal miners to warn them of dangerous conditions in the coal mine, well, right now, we are the canary in the coal mine for the rest of biodiversity on the planet as a result of exposure to plastics.
Yeah. Sobering thought. Zara, let me turn to you. How does this make you feel, Zara? You know, obviously the three of us on this call, we're a little bit older than you, but this is your future that we're talking about. So it's interesting to me that you have chosen plastic and solutions to plastic to be your absolute focus rather than the overall climate crisis. So could you tell us a little bit about why you chose this mission? What was the epiphany for you?
Well, it's pretty scary, all that's happening, with the effects on health and just the environment on the whole. And when I started Hidden Plastic with my brother, I was 11. And the reason I chose plastics was because plastic is quite a visual problem. You can tell an 11-year-old about air pollution and our warming planet, but it's much harder to visualize than seeing a video of a turtle with a plastic straw stuck in its nose. And to that end, I was super passionate about the ocean. And it was that knowledge that humans are slowly destroying our planet. And it's sort of our role, it's our job to stop destroying it and to actually help to save it. And so that was what inspired us to start Hidden Plastic. And from there, it turns out the straw and the turtle is just the tip of the iceberg. It's a way bigger problem. It's contributing to climate change, as you already said. It's affecting air pollution. It's affecting human health. It's pretty terrifying. And the fact, unless action is taken now, it's only going to get worse, is pretty scary for my generation and the ones to come.
If I could add a note of optimism here, to have Zara's generation working as hard as they are now gives me optimism. Thank you, Zara.
82 is that's incredibly, that brings me hope. And the fact that many of the nations are coming together to create a treaty is really great.
And I know you were at the negotiations themselves.
Yes.
We met in Paris, and then we met again, obviously in Ottawa recently. And are you getting enough mic share when you're there, Zara? Are people communicating with you? Are you getting the attention that you need? Because I think sometimes you can look around those rooms and think, here's all the people that have created the problem. How many people are there that are actually inheriting the problem, that we're going to be leaving the legacy of dealing with it?
Well, for INC2 in Paris, my brother and I were the only under-18s present at the entire event. And we actually saw they later had an over-18s only restriction. Fortunately, we were able to make it to INC4 in Canada a couple of months ago. And they actually made progress and let more under-18s in, to a grand total of 4 out of 2,500 people.
Yeah. But you're not going to give up hope, are you? You're going to be there at the next one?
Hopefully. We'd like to.
Great. Well,
it's our future, and this treaty, the negotiations will hopefully be finished by the end of the year. And so this is sort of a once in a lifetime, a once in a planet opportunity to really have a say in the future of plastics.
Great. Thank you, Zara. All power to you. Carroll, I'd love to turn back to you and talk about how can we make industry move faster? How can we get governments to not wait for a global plastics treaty and then the inevitable delay of national action plans and so on? Is there really, through this aperture of the corporate risk of human health impact, is this something that you are seeing as an accelerant, the Achilles heel perhaps?
There are many, many ways to make industry, to make government, companies move faster. Ironically, one of those ways is the negotiation of the treaty, because when we are negotiating a treaty that is talking about plastic phase out of plastic products, any company, any investor considering sinking their money into a new facility to make plastics or a new line of products that depends on them has to think really carefully, is this money going to be well spent? And that is a really powerful signal, particularly when we start negotiating to make plastics cleaner, to make them safer, to ensure they include fewer chemicals, which is also going to make them more expensive, because the industry has been externalizing the costs of plastics for a very long time. And so when we make plastics cost what they should cost, they're going to be much more expensive and harder to come by. But you touched on other routes that we have, because we are seeing the companies who are behind the fossil fuel crisis and behind the plastic crisis increasingly being investigated, increasingly being litigated. And that is only going to accelerate, not only in the United States, but in courts, in human rights bodies around the world. And with that increased accountability comes new financial risk, comes new legal risk. And with that, I think still more incentive for change. And I think that, the other thing that we see, and this goes to the conversation we were just having, is that companies are now looking at plastic and seeing massive market and reputational risk. Who wants to be associated with big oil and big gas? Who wants to be associated with the drivers of the planetary poly crisis? And the truth is, very few responsible brands do. And I think this is another thing that is going to accelerate that transition away from plastics much more rapidly than we may anticipate. And so I think all of these things are sources of hope. And as Pete alluded, they are all deeply interconnected. We don't solve this with a single tool, with a single approach. We solve it by recognizing how deeply interconnected all of the problems we're fighting are.
Do you think it's possible for us to achieve the kind of the seismic change that we need to, if you just look at the fashion industry alone and look at the facts of nearly 70% of all textiles are now made from fossil fuel plastic in the form of polyester and all of its derivatives. Can you imagine that the legislation or corporate reputation would be enough?
One of the most powerful things that you learn in doing this work is that nobody is doing it alone. And that when you start to recognize that we are all of us fighting different heads of the same hydra, fighting the same problem from different approaches. One of the things you learn is we live in a world that's not only filled with partners, but filled with leaders, filled with visionaries, filled with voices. And when we recognize that no one of us is responsible for changing the system alone, but there are in fact millions upon millions of us who are changing it together, then what seems like it has to be utterly unachievable becomes ultimately inevitable. Is it going to be difficult? Yes, it's going to be very difficult. Are there going to be massive uncertainties? Beyond doubt. And challenges and setbacks, there always are. But we have started on a path of real transformation here. And once you start down a road like that, it is very, very hard to get off of it.
If I could add to that.
Yes, please add, Pete.
I think Carroll's right. Absolutely correct. Especially when you take into account the fact that companies are realizing that their customers want safer materials. And actually, there's fascinating legislation underway in Europe right now called the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, sponsored by the European Commission, which is not just figuring out how to ban bad stuff. They're also talking about putting major resources, euros, into the innovation that's needed to replace the bad stuff. And they are doing that in anticipation of markets continuing to grow. Now, I've worked on this, as I said, for 30 years. Most of you, Zara, you know that lots of stores say BPA free about polycarbonate plastic. Well, I helped start that, okay? And now I can go into any drugstore in the world that sells baby bottles and see the consequence of consumers wanting safer products because they say, this one's BPA free. Now, we all know, Carroll especially, that BPA free is a bit of a misleading thing because they're substituting other chemicals for BPA that are just like BPA. And so that's something of a trap, but we're getting around that. And the European Commission's commitment to a new era of regulation and innovation together, I think, are going to speed up this transition, warp speed. There's some things we have to overcome, but I'm optimistic that that process will be effective.
Great, thank you, Pete. Zara, I'd love to talk to you about one of the materials that we all know is going to be a major part of the solution and comes from our ocean. So tell us a little bit about your work in seaweed.
Yes, so as Carroll said, there's going to be a lot more funding coming into the solutions. And seaweed is a solution that seems to have a very bright future. And that's because it can be created, an extract from seaweed can be made into a plastic-like alternative that is fully biodegradable, and in some cases even edible. So here, well, that is seaweed. Yeah. And unlike, it looks pretty much like plastic, except if this ended up in the environment, it would biodegrade within a couple of weeks. Whereas with many bioplastics that you often see in like stores, in the products, they're not actually biodegradable if they end up in nature. They require very special composting facility and just very special conditions. So it's not really a great solution if it were to end up in the ocean per se. Whereas seaweed, not only is it fully compostable, but it can also grow much more sustainably than if it were terrestrial crops. Seaweed requires no terrestrial land, it requires no fresh water, no fertilizers, and it can grow pretty quickly too. So that's pretty exciting.
I love all that. I'm super excited by the opportunities of seaweed and algae and so many of these natural derivatives. And obviously, you know, our work at Plastic Free, which is all about true circularity, you know, just borrowing nutrients from nature and making sure that when we give them back, they go back still in their nutrient state. And seaweed is a key part of that. Are you working on any particular projects at the moment that you can tell us about?
I've been in comms with Notpla and some of the other companies who produce the seaweed alternatives. And I've actually recently pitched it to Delta Airlines. So there's a chance they might, hopefully someday soon, carry it on their in-flight meals. We're early stages still.
That's wonderful. That's what we need. I want to ask somebody, all of you actually, a particular question, which is really relating it back to Climate Day, which is, what do these words make you think? No climate action, no peace. Let's start with Carroll.
Russian tanks that rolled into Ukraine were not only fueled by fossil fuels, they were funded and financed by fossil fuels. And when Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine happened, not only Ukrainian activists, but climate activists around the world called on governments to confront Russia's oil and gas machine as a critical tool for accelerating peace. And that call is still outstanding. But it's only one facet of these issues. One, we need to recognize that in countries around the world, the intersections between oil and gas exploitation have been linked again and again to violence within countries, to violence across borders. So there are very fundamental ways in which the climate crisis and instability are linked. But there's also the much more basic idea that climate justice means viewing other humans as humans, viewing the natural world as a world of which we are a part, rather than something from which we are apart. And it's only when we begin to do that, it's only when we begin to recognize that the actions we need to take are actions not just for ourselves, not just for our families or communities, but for something greater than us, as something that reflects a shared global mission, a shared global purpose, that is when we will achieve real climate action. And that is also the path to greater peace, is recognizing the fundamental humanity of everyone around us, and their rights to the same sort of peace, the same sort of stability, the same sort of livable climate that we want for ourselves. And the last thing that I'll say on this is to bring this back to plastics. If you look at the drivers of the plastics crisis, if you look at the communities where plastic are born, over and over what you find is systemic injustice, systemic racism, legacies of oppression. And addressing the plastic crisis, addressing the climate crisis, means confronting those legacies and starting to build a world that is truly sustainable and just for all of us, not just for some of us.
So beautifully put, Carroll. Thank you for that.
May I add to that?
I'm coming to you now, Pete. It's all yours.
That was a beautiful statement, Carroll. Really, really beautiful. Thank you. Let me add one dimension to it that you didn't mention explicitly, and that's that we are going to see migration from places where people can no longer live because it's too hot or it's underwater or it's too contaminated. Migration to the bastions of the world that right now are accepting them, but we're actually increasingly fighting them, as the elections in Europe just demonstrated that there's a lot of discomfort with all the immigrants coming into Europe, and we know that's happening in the US. The flood of immigrants that's going to be upon us if we can't deal with the climate crisis is unimaginable compared to the current levels that are happening. Look at South America, which is the place I have a lot of experience in. People who live on the west coast of South America depend upon water from the glaciers of the Andes. And those glaciers, actually, they're almost gone. And that's going to force tens, if not hundreds of millions of people to move outside of their borders. And a lot of them are going to try and get into the US. Brazil, and floods in southern Brazil have just displaced several million people. And I was reading a story about it just this week. Many of them are saying, we're not returning. We're going somewhere else. And where is that somewhere else? Well, a lot of it's going to be across borders. We are not even in the slightest way prepared for the level of migration that will take place in coming years in the not too distant future.
Yep. And all of those people feeling that they have had to leave their land because their land has been made unlivable, and largely through no fault of their own, no action of their own.
That's absolutely correct.
But great addition, Pete. Thank you. And Zara, coming to you now. So those words, no climate action, no peace. What does that make you think?
It's also not just impacting. Climate is a problem beyond borders. And also some countries are unfairly impacting others. For instance, one of the other under-18s at INC4 was a 16-year-old from Indonesia. And she was bringing the message of her people where countries like the UK and the US are shipping their recycling abroad to places like Indonesia. And it's actually being sorted in her local river, this plastic. And the plastics they don't want are just being left there going downstream. And this river is drinking water for 5 million people downstream, it's directly impacting something so vital as water. And there's a quote that I recently heard, which is that we're all on the same plane. And it's not quite the boat, it's a plane, because some people might be in first class, but if the plane comes down, we're all going with it. And this will eventually impact all of us, no matter where we're from.
Yeah, however much money you hoard, we're all on that plane. It's a great analogy. So guys, we've just got one final question. that I'd love you all to just take a minute to answer, and then we're so bang on time. And that is this. Can you tell me one thing that you are terrified of and one thing that you are very excited about? Carroll.
I have a reputation for scaring people when I talk. So this is I think the thing that terrifies me is the fact that so many dimensions of the plastic crisis are invisible. And we know from the climate context that things that are hard to see are hard to mobilize people on. But we are in the midst of what can only be described as a human scale population experiment, a population scale human experiment on the effects of toxic exposures from plastics. And many of these effects we know will span generations. That is a staggering reality. And at the same time, we know that microplastics are interfering with the productivity and the carbon sequestering capacity of our soils. They have the potential to be disrupting oceanic carbon sinks. The scale and the scale of microplastic pollution in our bodies, in our world, is only now being understood, because we've understood, like, we're increasingly discovering that the problem was our nets were too small. The means for detecting the plastics were too coarse, and that there are far more plastics in ourselves, in our environment, than we understood. And that is terrifying when you recognize that tendency towards human inertia in the face of the invisible. Mm. But what gives me hope is the recognition from more and more people around the world that they are all fighting this together, that they are fighting different dimensions of the same underlying problem. And it's the power of activists who are already activists when they're 11, 12, 13, 18 years old, coupled with indigenous leaders, coupled with grandmothers and grandfathers who are taking stands, with business leaders, with lawyers, with scientists. That is an extraordinary array of voices and skills and perspectives, all fundamentally pointing in the same direction. There is, for a long time, I would say to people that the arc of history bends towards justice. But I've realized that that's not completely true. And the reason is the arc of history does not bend towards justice. It is bent towards justice. It's a very active process, and it takes all of us. And what gives me hope is that increasingly we recognize where the world needs to bend. We've found our footing. We've found our leverage points. And increasingly we're starting to pull together. And in that, I think, is the hope.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. People talk about collaboration. We need it like we have never, ever, ever seen before. Pete.
Again, Carroll, brilliant. Thank you for those comments. I will add something that frightens me pretty deeply, much more tangible than the issues Carroll laid out effectively. And it has to do with one of the effects, just one of the effects of plastic on human health. We now know that sperm count has declined by 50%, or actually more now, over the last 5 decades. And my colleague, Shauna Swan, has shown through data, massive amounts of data, that if you project those declines into the future, that roughly by 2045, young men, for the most part, will not be able to reproduce the old-fashioned way. They will need artificial reproduction. And that's going to make it difficult because artificial reproduction is very expensive. So reproduction of the human race may become the luxury of the rich. And that is a frightening prospect. Now, with respect to what gives me hope, it's the innovative spirit that is arising in lots of different places. With Zara, for example, and her work on seaweed. With Carroll, and what he knows is happening with the activism and legal issues that are there. And for me, the chemical innovation, I'm a chemist. I'm an adjunct professor of chemistry at Carnegie Mellon University. Chemistry is necessary for solving this problem, and it can. That gives me hope if we make the right investments. And I should say, I'm a biologist working at Carnegie Mellon in the chemistry department. I'm not a real chemist, but I know enough to know that this is a pathway forward.
Real enough for us, Pete. Zara, let's wrap up and finish with you. Tell us what terrifies you. I'm scared to hear it myself, actually, but also what makes you really excited for the future.
What terrifies me is inaction. And the fact that there's certain nations, for say, at the treaty, who are trying to water down the text so much that it doesn't really hold any real power to it. And just, since it's not always the most visual, you can't, well, I just said earlier, it's a visual problem, but you can't see the full scale of it. And just the fact that action may be taken too late. But what I'm most positive about is also the fact that people are starting to listen. There's a lot of people putting a lot of effort into this, and I think we can solve this. It's really good to see there's a lot of feasible solutions out there on the whole life cycle, from to stop the production of plastics, the alternatives, the reusable methods, to downstream measures to collect the legacy plastic. And I think we can do this.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to end on that note of optimism that we can do this. I want to thank my panel for all your great insights. Really extraordinary. And wishing you a happy Climate Day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.